the uniquenesses I kind of put on a shelf till I see, well, are there others? And how do those fit or align? But the commonalities, it's surprising because literally they're all over the globe. And they're describing the same experience. They're describing the same God. And it doesn't fit cultural or religious expectations all the time. And yet they're common.
It is deeply personal. That's the thing that to me was so absolutely surprising and affirming and validating and wonderful about the experience. It was like returning home to a spiritual home. And so many NDEs are in agreement about that.
Hello and welcome to Unbelievable, the show that gets Christians, skeptics, and all those in between debating the topics that matter to all of us. I'm your host, Billy Hallowell, and my two guests on Unbelievable today have thought deeply on the topic of NDEs, otherwise known as near-death experiences, and they've come up with some very different and interesting conclusions. Today, we're going to hear those descriptions of near-death experiences from both of my guests and debate what is consciousness, whether we have a soul separate to our material being, and a number of other subjects, and what is the nature of God these NDEers are experiencing. I'm honored to have two esteemed guests who bring unique perspectives to this fascinating topic. First, we have Dr. Eben Alexander. He's an internationally acclaimed neurosurgeon who experienced a profound near-death journey that challenged his understanding of consciousness and spirituality. His New York Times bestselling book, Proof of Heaven, A Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Afterlife, shares his transformative experience and its implications for our understanding of existence and our beings beyond the physical realm. Joining Dr. Alexander is John Burke, an author and pastor who has dedicated decades to studying near-death experiences. His latest book, Imagine the God of Heaven, Near-Death Experiences, God's Revelation and the Love You've Always Wanted. That book offers profound insights into the intersection of NDEs and biblical teachings. So we have Dr. Alexander's journey from skepticism to a belief in the infinite reach of the soul, coupled with John Burke's comprehensive research on NDE accounts. What is the significance of NDEs and what they reveal about the nature of God? So to both of you, I want to welcome you to Premiere Unbelievable. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, great to be here, Billy. Thanks for having me here.
So we've got a lot to get into. I want to start, both of you have very different journeys. One of you has a near-death experience. And so, Dr. Alexander, I want to start with you. We'll start with your story, and then John will work into your experience. But tell us a little bit about, I know this is a loaded question, but I'll let you sort of take it there. You've spoken about it quite a bit before, but what did you experience? How did you find yourself experiencing this realm?
Well, at the time, I was 54 years old. This is back in November 2008. And I was driven into coma very kind of suddenly, early in the morning, due to a severe case of bacterial meningoencephalitis that took me from, symptom onset to deep coma and seizures within about 3.5 hours. It turns out that my coma was absolutely caused by the meningitis, which is important. It was not a medically induced coma. I went deep into coma before any sedation was ever given. I came out of coma while I was under heavy sedation. The lay press tries to take this apart by pretending this was a medically induced coma, which, essentially would not take away from its value. But the fact that it was induced by meningitis, I think, makes a giant difference. And that's all confirmed with a case report on my medical records that came out in September 2018. That made it clear my brain was in no shape to harbor any dream or hallucination. That's really why I think my case is so important to the scientific community. I had this extraordinary journey all at a time when my brain was unable to muster any kind of consciousness according to all the principles of neuroscience. And to try and be brief here, an unusual feature of my NDE was amnesia. I had no knowledge of Earth, humans, no language. None of Eben Alexander's personal memories were available to me. That almost never happens in an NDE, but it happened in mine. And it's important that NDEs are always tailored for the individual. So for a neurosurgeon fascinated by the brain-mind connection and consciousness, my NDE answered a tremendous number of questions, proving that memory is not even stored in the brain, which is one of the last coffins in the nail of materialist neuroscience. So it started in what I call Earthworm's Eye View, primitive coarse unresponsive realm. I was rescued from that by a slowly spinning white light with a perfect musical melody. It led up into a brilliant ultra-real gateway valley. That valley had many Earth-like features, but it was kind of like Plato's world of ideals. It was a world of perfection. There was no death or decay. That's a realm where our life reviews would happen, where we would go through all the events of our life. And when you study life reviews, scientifically, it turns out they're fascinating because they happen in a kind of a non-personal realm, a universal realm, where if we've been busy handing out pain and suffering to others, our life review, we have to feel that. We feel what we dished out to others. It's like the golden rule being written into the fabric of the universe, love, kindness, compassion, mercy. These are the deep lessons NDEers bring back to this world. And that's what I was witnessing in full form in this beautiful Gateway Valley. And I was accompanied by a guardian angel who was very important in the story. People who read Proof of Heaven realized my discovery of her identity 4 months after my coma was critical in my accepting the reality of the journey and further understanding what happened. So anyway, in that Gateway Valley, speck of awareness on a butterfly wing, millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in these vast formations. I remember her message to me, this beautiful guardian angel, sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, broad cheekbones. And I think this was the main message I was to bring back. So similar to many other near-death experiencers, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are richly cared for. Mm-hmm. And from that point on, it was really kind of off to the races, because I remember the angelic choirs above that were emulating chants and anthems, hymns that would thunder through my awareness and just enliven this incredible scene of festivities with thousands of beings in this meadow down below that I later labeled in my writings, Souls Between Lives. Well, that was all just a pathway up to the highest levels. And I remember seeing all of four-dimensional space-time collapsing down, all of that spiritual realm with a different ordering of causality, which I call deep time or meta time. That's the realm where you can see your birth, your death, everything in between simultaneously. That's the important point. They're not slave to kind of our earth time, flow of the river of time that we're used to in this narrative of living these lives, but it's a much broader sense of one's existence. That's where kind of the soul perspective comes into admission. Past life events, future life events, all of this can be presented to us in that life review. In a way that show us that we're far more than these physical bodies living birth to death and nothing more. So I ascended up into what I call the core realm. The core was a complete resolution of all dualities. In our world, the dualities include, good and evil, darkness, light, masculine, feminine, all the different scales and spectra of things. But it all resolves down into oneness in that beautiful, loving presence of that creative God force. And not only that, but in the core realm, I recognize my very conscious awareness was directly sourced in that infinitely loving God force. So in other words, we're never, distant or separate from that force when we know to look within, as said in the Bible, the kingdom of God lies within us. That is absolutely a statement of the modern scientific elucidation of the brain-mind connection of idealism or panentheism, the God force being in all that is, which is where our third book, Living in Mindful Universe, really goes with the data to unite science and spirituality. So in my NDE, many lessons there in the core, I would spontaneously tumble back down to that earthworm eye view. By remembering the musical notes of the melodies, I could conjure up these light portals and return to these spiritual levels. Did that many times. There finally came a point where I could no longer conjure up that melody that ushered me out of the gateway, out of the earthworm eye view into the Gateway Valley. But I knew by that point I could trust in the universe that There was a deeply loving God force at the core of it all. And the other important thing I'd like to state here is I was brought up a Christian, but I came to realize that God force is universal. And it's all about love, kindness, compassion, mercy, acceptance when necessary, forgiveness. These are the deep principles that near-death experiences teach us about living together and sharing this kind of one mind, this God mind that we all do share. And also remind people that more than 90% of those who've had a near-death experience come back not just believing, but knowing through experience the reality of a loving personal God force at the core of all that exists. So to doubt that force is real is to really deny the evidence of tens of millions of reports of people who've had these experiences. And it turns out at the very end of it all, as I said, I was no longer allowed to ascend up to these higher levels. That's when I felt thousands of beings going off around in the distance, heads bowed, murmuring energy, the power of prayer. That's what was being demonstrated as I wrote that up weeks later. And then finally, the six faces I saw at the very end that served as vertical time anchors because they were people who were physically present the last 48 hours or so of coma. And that's very important. I explain all that in the book, but they help me to conclude that the vast majority of the coma journey happened between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of my 7-day coma. Very important in the scientific analysis of the experience. And when I did come back waking up to that world, it was only after I'd seen that sixth face. And that's what really brought me back to this world. My amnesia was still very much in power. So I didn't recognize his face. It turns out it was a 10-year-old boy. It's my son, Bond. And of course, that name was far more appropriate than I'd ever realized before. He was my bond to this world. And it was my love for him, even though I didn't even remember who he was. But it was day 7 of coma. The doctors had held a conference where they told my family I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival to 2% no chance of recovery. Bond overheard that. It was now much worse than he'd been told. So he came running down the hallway, pulled open my eyelids, one eye over there, one eye over there. Neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows that's a horrible scene. And I could promise you, I did not see him with my eyes or hear him with my ears. I was far too along the way in this death process. But it was his pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay, even though I didn't understand the words, that compelled me to come back to this world. My love, my sense of responsibility to another soul. And when I did wake up, I didn't even recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside. Again, my amnesia still active, but that all recovered very quickly. Language came back within hours, days. A lot of personal memories, every bit of it. All my long-term memories, neuroscience knowledge, cosmology, et cetera, returned over about 2 months. And I've spent the 15 and a half years since that coma working with other scientists around the world, other experiencers, people in spiritual and theological traditions to try and come up with a better explanation from a scientific perspective of how all these things can be. It also involves the reincarnation literature, which is something that was shown to me in my coma, even though I knew nothing of the reincarnation support from science before my coma. So I had to study that, but then found this tremendous body of knowledge gleaned by investigators who lived only an hour drive north of me at the University of Virginia, who had been studying past life memories in children for 6 decades, and 1,700 of the cases that they'd investigated were actually solved. That is, they found the person who the child described. So all of this combines into a much grander worldview, and that's of course what we cover in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, and that's what I love discussing in these kinds of panels.
Well, and we're gonna get into some of the areas of disagreement, which I know you will have on some of the things you just even outlined there at the end. But one of the big areas of agreement, obviously, John, is that near-death experiences unfold, that they are real, and that they happen. And your experience is very different in that you've been researching this. You've been looking at this extensively, probably more than anybody else has. The profound caseload that you've experienced and looked at is pretty amazing. But let's talk about your journey, John, into this. You're obviously a pastor. You look at this from a faith perspective, but you didn't always look at it the way you do now. What was that journey into belief in NDEs?
Yeah, I actually I kind of came to faith through NDE research. So I was an agnostic. I too grew up going to a Christian church, but I was an engineer. I studied engineering. I worked as an engineer. So that's the way my mind works. I'm very analytical. And even from a young age, I was like, well, how do you know there's a God? And how do you know Jesus is the Son of God? And nobody really could answer my questions or took time to. And so I just decided it's not true and went my own way. And then my dad was dying of cancer. And someone gave him the very first research by Dr. Moody, where he chronicled near-death experiences. And I saw it on his bedside dresser. I picked it up and I started just looking at it, and I read the whole book in one night. And I said at the end of it, oh my gosh, like this might actually be the evidence I was looking for. Like maybe this whole afterlife, God, Jesus stuff is real. And I said that because of how many were saying those kinds of things. And what was intriguing to me is that here are people who have clinically died. In other words, no heartbeat, no brain waves. So with no EEG, it's like Dr. Alexander would say, where are the memories being stored? If the brain is, the source of our consciousness. So that didn't lead me to faith. It just opened me to explore, to seek. And I ended up, I started reading the Bible. That's kind of where I started. I've also, since then, I've studied a lot of the religions of the world, at the same time, trying to make sense of it. Like, how do all these pieces fit together? So for the past 35 years, I have studied probably close to 1,500 cases of near-death experience. And I also, during that time, I went from a career in engineering to become a pastor. And mainly, the church we started, our motto is no perfect people allowed, doubters welcome, just come as you are. Because I realized that, there are a lot of people that were just like me, that they had a lot of questions. They have doubts, they have struggles, but church wasn't giving them a place to wrestle in a safe environment. And that when people do seek, there are a lot of answers. There is a lot of evidence. I like to say it would take me a lot more faith right now to disbelieve in God, and in particularly the God of Jesus, than it would, to not. And that's just because of all the evidence I've seen. So it was 2015 that I wrote the book Imagine Heaven, what I was trying to do is take my 35 years of research and chronicling the commonalities. In other words, what are things that overlappingly people say when they have no brain waves or no heartbeat, and yet they're resuscitated and they come back talking about this life more real than this one, in a place more beautiful, not unlike Earth, but with a vibrancy and colors beyond our color spectrum, and as real relationally too. They meet people on the other side who died before them. And many meet this God of light and love, who is personal, who knows them. They have a life review, like Eben said, where time works differently. It's like Peter said in 2 Peter 3:8, to the Lord, a 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. And many NDEs have said almost the same thing to me. I think, in fact, Eben said almost the same exact thing in Proof of Heaven. He said, I don't know if it was I don't remember how you put it, but if it was a second or if it was, days. And so they have this life review. So all these commonalities, and I've traced about 40 of commonalities that people say, having interviewed people on every continent except Antarctica. Penguins, it turns out, don't have near-death experiences. Not found any yet. But every continent in the world, and they have these overlapping commonalities. And my interest was showing as well that this God has been revealing these things throughout history, and the Jewish prophets and Jesus reveal the same things. And so I'm tracing how these commonalities are really the expectation that's been there all along through the Bible. And people don't see that many times. And many people have a very skewed view. And I think these near-death experiences really help elucidate what Scripture is actually saying.
Yeah, well, and John, I want to ask one question off the back of that, and we've got a couple of minutes here left in this segment, and Dr. Alexander will pick up if we don't get to you on this on the other side. But how do you interpret then the diversity, John, of the experiences that people also have? Any differences that they might be having? Particularly when it comes to cultural, religious backgrounds, are those differences overestimated? Are they under, just based on what you've seen?
Well, I think, like Eben said, every experience has its uniquenesses, but every experience has its overlapping commonalities as well. So, like the butterfly example that Eben gave, incredibly cool. Like, I can't wait for that. but I haven't heard others who've said a similar thing. However, the Gateway Valley, he describes the beauty of it, the people, the angels, and the multiple senses at the same time, hypersenses, all those things. The orb of light, this divine God orb of light, who is personal, who knows us, the life review, all those things are common, but everyone also has uniquenesses. So for me, as a researcher, what I've tried to do is kind of the uniquenesses I kind of put on a shelf till I see, well, are there others, and how do those fit or align? But the commonalities, it's surprising because literally they're all over the globe, and they're describing the same experience. They're describing the same God, and it doesn't fit cultural or religious expectations all the time, and yet they're common.
Yeah, and we've got about 2 minutes here, Dr. Alexander. If you want to give a response to that, because obviously you have your experience, and so you're seeing that, and then you're hearing these other stories that maybe have elements that don't match up. How do you interpret that?
Well, I can tell you, I remember the first time I ever told my story to a group of NDEs, and that was such a giant quantum leap because everybody in the group, we just knew what we were talking about. And the words, as we all admit, the words do not do justice to the experience. Our language is great for describing a trip to Disney World, but it's pathetic at describing these incredible, journeys into a realm of eternity. And I would simply say that the contents of the NDE do not depend on your religious upbringing. That's the important thing to make. Your interpretation of it, the language you use to describe it, might refer to your prior religious beliefs, but they can also be dramatically altered. For example, in my case, I grew up in a very conventional Methodist church in North Carolina. Being one with God was not something I'd ever heard, and yet that was a profound part of my experience. Likewise, all the reincarnation vision that I had in what I call the Ender's net vision of these interwoven threads of our lifetimes, all leading towards this golden center of God consciousness to which our civilization is headed. So it's not a blind mechanistic wheel of reincarnation, but one that's more about becoming one with God, as the Christianity that I grew up with taught me. And yet it takes more than one lifetime to actually do this ascent. And, I didn't know anything about the scientific data supporting reincarnation before my coma, but it was crystal clear to me in that Ender's net vision that we're reincarnated. Life reviews, every bit of that was shown to me, in spite of the fact I couldn't have an Eben Alexander life review because of my amnesia. So these experiences educate us about kind of the spiritual realms, and it's not all just due to prior beliefs and that kind of thing, but these people come back not just believers, but knowing the reality of that God force. And there's nothing you're ever going to do from a materialist science standpoint to ever convince them otherwise. Their experience has shown them the reality. And this is why I also like to share that through meditation and prayer, centering prayer, people can come to the same knowledge. You don't have to have a near-death experience. You can gain this through personal experience, through prayer, through connecting with that God force, with higher soul. So I'm a huge fan of meditation and centering prayer. It's a great vacation from this crazy world we live in, and it helps you to make sense of your waking life. That's the big lesson from NDEs.
Well, we need to take a quick break in a moment here. You're listening to Unbelievable, and with me are Dr. Eben Alexander and John Burke. They both have experience studying and looking at near-death experiences, and they have been left profoundly changed by those experiences and the research that they have done. I'm Billy Hallowell, and we will return to the discussion in just a moment. But we want you to take a moment to rate the show on whatever podcast platform you're using. And as always, you can email us at unbelievable@premier.org. You can also get in touch with us on social media at UnbelievableFE on X or at Premier Unbelievable on Instagram or Facebook. And if you want to interact with our Facebook page, that's where you go, Premier Unbelievable there as well. We will be back in just a moment.
Pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us, that provide us social support, a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it.
It's amazing how quickly ostensible deontologists transform before our very eyes into utilitarians on this question. We're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms. The arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. The difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
If people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here. This show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online, so thanks again.
Welcome back to part 2. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. We are discussing NDEs, also known as near-death experiences. Have you experienced one? If yes, please get in touch with us and let us know. You are listening to Premier Unbelievable with me, Billy Hallowell, and my guests today are Dr. Eben Alexander and John Burke. As we explore the commonalities and the interpretations of near-death experiences, we want to get to those deeper truths about consciousness, the soul, and the divine, and ultimately ask, what kind of God do these NDEs point toward? And so that brings us back here, John. I want to come to you. There's a lot of skepticism around NDEs. There's people watching this or listening to this right now who probably have some of that skepticism. They don't think it's real. They think it's conjured up. What do you think drives that skepticism when you do have a lot of people, as you've investigated, looking at this issue and saying that they've gone through it and experienced it?
Well, I mean, I had a lot of skepticism initially, because there have been a lot of alternate explanations. It's anoxia, it's a lack of oxygen to the brain. Maybe it's, drugs or a hallucination, or it's a trick the brain's playing, either, as we're dying to ease our dying, or, like skeptic Dr. Michael Shermer says now, as it is booting back up, it's doing this. And one of the reasons there have been, my friend Dr. Jeffrey Long has chronicled about 30 alternate explanations, and there's a new one every year. And like he likes to say, the reason there are 30 is there's not one that is good. If there was one alternate explanation that could explain it all away, all the evidence, it would stick, but it doesn't. And in this new book, in Imagine the God of Heaven, in chapter 2, I go into the 10 points of evidence that convinced me when I was a skeptical engineer, but have also convinced many skeptical medical doctors that really the soul or the consciousness does live on after our existence. I'll give you just a few of them. So one, when people die, when they clinically die, they typically say they leave their body, but they have a spiritual body, they're still themselves, and they're in the room of their resuscitation. So they're usually up above and they're watching what's happening in the room. And like Dr. Pim van Lommel is a cardiologist in Holland who has studied this, and he wrote in the Lancet about a guy who comes into a hospital in Holland. He's found in a park, no heartbeat, no brain waves, but they had to intubate him to try to shock his heart, get it going again. And the nurse noticed dentures, so took the dentures out and put them in the lower drawer of the crash cart. They shock his heart, they get his heart started, but he never comes to in the ER. They roll him into another room. A week later, he comes to in the other room, and he's complaining about, they lost my dentures. And then he sees a nurse in the hallway and says, that nurse knows where my dentures are. And then he goes on to explain that I was there in that room in the ER up above. And he describes who was in the room, what they did, and how that nurse took his dentures and put them in the lower drawer of that cart with all the bottles on it. And that's where they found his dentures. And, this was written up in the Lancet, Europe's most prestigious, medical journal. Dr. Sabum, another cardiologist, wrote up his 5-year study of near-death experiences in JAMA, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, showing that there is something grounded in our reality. Dr. Jan Holden did a study of close to 100 near-death experience patients who had I think they had all had cardiac arrest. And the observations they made that could be checked out, she basically was exploring that. So these are veridical observations of about 100 patients. And what she found, each one might make 10 or so observations, right? What she found is 92% of their observations while out of their body were completely accurate. 92%. Another 6% of their observations were mostly accurate. Only 2% were inaccurate. Turns out that was one of the patients. And so you're talking about something incredibly veridical. I mean, this is like real life stuff that grounds these experiences and what they're saying while they had no brainwaves. Now, again, where are the memories stored? That's another point of evidence. But a second point of that's one point of evidence of 10 that I list. The second one is when people born blind have a near-death experience, they can see, and they see the same things. And in Imagine God, the God of Heaven, and Imagine Heaven, I go into how they see things they would not have heard on earth in this heavenly realm that Eben experienced. Like, for instance, how light comes out of everything, and this light is life and love. And I tie it to how that's exactly what Revelation 21 says, that God, the glory of God is the light of heaven. And of course, God is love and God is life. And it's coming out of everything. Well, how would blind people, why would blind people, multiple blind people, die, have this experience, and say the same thing? And that correlates with what sighted people see. And all the observations of people born blind and people born with sight correlate in their near-death experience. And then you have another fascinating thing. If you have testimony in a court of law, 10 people who are eyewitnesses, right? And they all say exactly the same thing, that's collusion. They would throw that testimony out. But if you have 10 eyewitnesses who say overlapping things because they saw the accident or the crime from a different angle, but they have uniquenesses too, well, that's the strongest testimony. That's the strongest evidence. And that's what we see with near-death experiences. So for instance, all over the world, about 31% of near-death experiencers have a life review. About 48% experience the same God of light and love, who is personal. About 57% see dead relatives who they meet on the other side, okay, and so on. Now, if it's just in the brain, why wouldn't it be 100%? If it's just a human brain thing, why wouldn't it be 100% or 0%, right? Why variation that also overlaps? So Those are just three of 10 points of evidence that I go into, and none of the alternate explanations so far can explain, really what Occam's razor would say. That's that scientific principle of, if you have a lot of different explanations, go with the simplest, right? That makes sense of the data. And the simplest explanation is what near-death experiencers consistently say. My soul left my body and my consciousness lived on after my physical body, had no heartbeat, no brainwaves.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable hearing you both talk about this, because there's so many areas of overlap and agreement. And we're going to get into some of the areas of maybe disagreement or divergent views on this in a little bit. But Dr. Alexander, I want to come to you on this, and feel free to add, before you answer this question, anything you want to what John just said. But I find it interesting, in your experience, being, a man of science, you come back from this experience, you then publicly talk about it. I would love to hear from you what it was like to have to sort of, remedy that science mind that you had with what you experienced, and then also dealing with the outside voices coming in, I'm sure, in, your industry, who maybe have been very skeptical of some of what you've said.
Well, I mean, first of all, I would point out that my biggest support over the last 15 years since going public with this has been from the scientific community. So just throw out of your mind that this is science versus, an NDE account. And I have many colleagues who, embrace this story. I've had many scientists who have reached out to me to thank me for going public with my story, because to them, the conventional party line didn't work. Materialism, birth to death, nothing more, brain creates consciousness, did not fit the data. And it absolutely does not fit the data. There's a tremendous amount of information that goes beyond, neuroscience and the hard problem of consciousness, as it was defined by David Chalmers in the mid-1990s. You've got philosophy of mind and the binding problem, the apparent unity of consciousness within the individual, very hard to explain if we're trying to use a materialist model of multiple neuronal populations. Then you have all the evidence for non-local consciousness, remote viewing, telepathy. I mean, 35% of identical twins have powerful telepathic experiences, where one twin can touch a hot stove, the other twin 1,000 miles away develops a blister and feels pain. That is a strong mental connection. And when you scientifically study these things, instead of saying, well, it's never happened to me, so it can't be so, but scientists who study these, there is a picture emerging of the primacy of consciousness that is very strong, that fully allows for the afterlife and for reincarnation, for all of these experiences to be real. It looks at the brain as a filter. That's not a new concept. It was, William James, William James, who was head of psychology at Harvard in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was a big fan of filter theory. Likewise, F.C.S. Schiller, Aldous Huxley in the U.S., Henri Bergson, talking about the brain as filtering in a little eddy current of that God mind of pure consciousness, which we assume is ours and ours alone. But as I said, and as we demonstrate in great fashion in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, it was co-written with my partner, Karen Newell, we make it very clear that all these things, including the non-local consciousness and parapsychological evidence, near-death experiences, all of this supports this primacy of consciousness. And then in commentary to what John was just discussing, I would also add, not only do we have all these veridical cases of near-death experiences where people know things they couldn't possibly know through ordinary channels, and yet it demonstrates this profound kind of ability of mind to exist in a grander fashion when it's liberated from the brain and body. I would say some of the best evidence for that is not just in these veridical cases of near-death experiences, but also there's a whole category of what's called shared death experiences. Now, I started giving talks about my NDE about 2 years before Proof of Heaven came out. And at those talks, many people would come up and share their personal stories with me afterwards. And most of them, to me, were after-death communications or near-death experiences. But there were some, about 1 in 20 of those, that were a shared death. That is, for example, is a person standing out in his garden while his mother is 1,000 miles away in the dying process. Her soul comes through, grabs his soul, takes it along, even to witnessing a full-blown life review of her soul before his soul comes back and he's got the story to tell, shared death. In fact, there's a group in California headed up by William Peters, Shared Crossing Project. I highly encourage people to get in touch with them if you're interested. But he is pursuing ways of training people to actually increase the likelihood that they'll have a shared death experience with a loved one who is passing. So that's how far this kind of science has gone. People using these phenomena and trying to cultivate an ongoing relationship with their loved one as they leave their body. And he's having success in about 50% of the people that he works with now. So amazing work, shared death experiences, but also, people say, oh, well, near death, they didn't die. I want to know what happens when we die. Well, Dr. Christopher Kerr, I'm sorry, he's head of Hospice Buffalo in New York. He's written a beautiful book about 4 years ago, Death is But a Dream, all hospice and terminal care. And what he finds is the very same things happen to those people. Life reviews begin, their loved ones come to escort them over to reassure them with comfort. And so the hospice and terminal care literature fully supports what we describe in the NDE literature of our loved ones coming to reunite with us in that life review, going through all the issues of our lifetime. And it's a reliving, not just a remembering of those events. So all of this points to a much grander kind of vision for what is the brain-mind relationship, what is the nature of conscious experience, and to simply pretend that it's the result of electron fluxes and chemical reactions in a 3.5-pound gelatinous mass floating in a warm, dark bath between my ears is just false. It doesn't fit the data. And of course, in my own personal case, I have a beautiful example of how my conscious awareness became far greater when it was no longer limited by the shackles of my physical brain and body. And that is pretty much a universal kind of interpretation of NDEs, that they're an expansion of conscious awareness. People become, as they're going in the dying process, telepathic with loved ones who are still here in the world. That's where you can have shared death experiences. But they also are telepathic with loved ones who have left the physical plane. The very same thing happened to my mother back in April of 2019, I'm sorry. And she was 99 years old. Spent her last 4 days very deep in kind of unresponsiveness because of a pulmonary infection and a fever. At that age, people don't handle it well. And so she was unresponsive, except 2 nights before she passed, she woke up, got out of bed, which her nurse says was impossible, and told her nurse, call my children, my mother's here, she's really here. And we only heard about that later because the nurse did not call us that night at 2:30 a.m. I wish she had. But that's a very, very common story. And in fact, when my mother was witnessing her own mother being there, to me, that's an absolute imprimatur. Bam, this is a stamp of approval of reality that it's a true experience. This is not made up hallucination, wishful thinking. This is what happens when we pass. We become connected again with our loved ones who have already passed. So we just need a far grander model for the brain-mind connection and the nature of reality. Materialism is clearly insufficient, and that's been thrown out the window even by a lot of materialist scientists. Especially, I would point out the Nobel Prize in Physics for Entanglement in 2022 is a gigantic admission from the Nobel Committee that science is no longer restricted to 4-dimensional space-time, and entanglement is an information passage that traverses beyond our normal notions of information acquisition in space and time. And that is a tremendous admission that basically means we're no longer harboring the falsehoods of, like Einstein and local realism, as it was called, the notion that all physics is because of interacting particles locally, and that there's a realism because a real objective physical world exists independently of our observation. By admitting to entanglement, they're admitting that some part of that local realism is not true, and it might be both parts. So it's a tremendous revolution going on in science. The evidence goes in one direction, so we'll never go backwards. No one who has any notion of the evidence will ever be defending materialism again because it fails so completely. And in fact, for people who need more scientific evidence, I would simply steer you to bigelowinstitute.org. There are 29 essays that were written 3 years ago for a contest, all scientific proof of the reality of conscious awareness after permanent bodily death. That was the challenge. Those 29 essays are a strong scientific refutation to anyone who says, no, there's no such thing as afterlife or reincarnation, because these papers very strongly support of this primacy of mind. As we do in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we go even further in making this case, unifying science and spirituality under the banner of idealism, which is admitting to the primacy of consciousness and not a material universe. The material universe emerges from consciousness, but it's that God mind that's ultimately responsible for it. And we share that connection. We're co-creators with that God mind of all that emerges into our reality. That's why our beliefs are so important. That's why going within, I highly recommend people spend a little time every day in meditation or centering prayer. That's a vacation from the tyranny of the ego mind, that little voice in our head that uses fear and anxiety to control us. That's not who we are. And that voice in your head is not your consciousness. It's your awareness of that voice. That is the deep mystery of consciousness. And we're sharing the self-awareness of the universe. And it's through that filtering mechanism of the brain. This is the scientific model that is currently unfolding. And for people who want to learn more about that science, go to scientificandmedical.net or galileocommission.org. You will learn a whole lot more. Of course, many of the people in those groups are endorsers of our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. So that's a shortcut to getting there. And there's also a free workbook that goes with that. It's a 33-day email drip campaign at ebenalexander.com, all for free. More than 12,000 people have taken that 33-day journey into the heart of consciousness at my website. And you can learn a lot more about all of these topics from that 33-day journey. So I highly encourage people to get on board there, or at innersanctumcenter.com, INNER sanctumcenter.com, another resource for a lot of this kind of scientific and spiritual unification.
Well, we've got time for one more question in this segment here, and then we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about what I'm about to ask you, John, in the next segment too. So if we don't get to all of it here, that's fine. But, a couple of issues that have come up a few times here, reincarnation being one of them. From your perspective, obviously, you're going to have a little bit of a different perspective, I would imagine, on this. In the research you've done, looking at this, is reincarnation something that has come up for you often?
Well, interestingly, let me back up and say this. There are a lot of mysteries, and especially surrounding, when you get into quantum mechanics and consciousness and near-death experiences, there's a lot of mystery. And, Richard Feynman, who's the guru of quantum mechanics, basically said, no one knows exactly what quantum mechanics means or says. And if they say they do, then you've met someone who all you know for sure is they're a liar. So, and he was, there are 14 different interpretations of the data that all fit the data of quantum mechanics. So there's not one understanding of that. I think Eben would agree on that. But my interest is primarily in who is this God that near-death experiencers, 48% of people having near-death experience. And let me just remind people, I've studied 1,500 of them. My friend, Dr. Jeffrey Long, studied 4,000 or 5,000 of them, but there are millions of them. 2019 studied, reported in the European Academy of Neurology, did a study across 35 countries and found that 5%, 1 out of 20 people near clinical death or clinically dead had a near-death experience. So we're talking about millions of people. In this new book, Imagine the God of Heaven, I interviewed people on every continent, 70 people, and you hear from them their experience of this God and they're from every single background. But consistently, this is the God of all nations. And what I'm trying to show is that this God of light and love, who is personal, didn't just show up in our age of modern medical resuscitation. It didn't just all of a sudden go, okay, good. Now that we can bring people back from death, I can show up and reveal myself. No, I'm showing that he's this God has been revealing himself before the establishment of any of the sacred writings of the world's religions. He claimed to appear to Abraham and Sarah and said, I'm going to create a nation out of you. This is Genesis 12, to bless all nations. 500 times throughout the prophets, which, they were writing over a 1,500-year period. The Bible's not one book, it's 66 books written over 1,500 years. It's a library. 500 times God is addressing all nations. Jesus comes and says, what he did for all nations, that there could be forgiveness. And this is what people experience in their life review. They know the wrongs they've done and they see the rights. But there's this compassion from God. There's this unconditional love. There's a willingness to forgive. And then in Revelation chapter 7, John claims he sees heaven. And there before the throne of God are people from every nation, every tribe, every language, every people group. So what I'm trying to show is that in these 70 interviews that I did in the last few years all over the globe, people are experiencing the same God. Who is this God? And, like Heidi was a Jewish girl raised by an atheist father who said, there is no God, your life is worthless. Jesus Christ is the biggest hoax ever perpetrated on mankind. And yet at 16, she always believed in God, always prayed to God. She was and grew up in a very abusive home. And when her horse landed on her at 16, she's up 30 feet in the air. She knows she's dead. And there's a light over her shoulder. And there she turns and there's this man of light. And she said, it was Jesus. And she said, it wasn't like I was wondering, why is a good Jewish girl like me doing with Jesus? I'm not supposed to be with Jesus. She said, no, I knew him. He was the God I had prayed to my whole life. Now, why would Heidi, who had learned that, experience Jesus? But this is common. Dr. Rajiv Parthi grew up in India, Hinduism. In medical school, he turned away from all that and just really became a materialist and was only interested in wealth. And he was an anesthesiologist and didn't believe in near-death experiences until he had his own. And in this, he is rescued from this hellish experience when he said he was repenting because he saw, the things that he had done wrong. He's brought, he said, by two Christian angels to this beautiful valley, not unlike what Eben describes, to this God, divine light, where he gets a life review and is told he's going to be sent back. But he has a Damascus Road experience where he sees this God of light and love, and he asks, who are you, Lord? And he says, out of the light steps Jesus. You look like Jesus. And he said, I'm Jesus, your Savior. Now that's exactly like Paul, in Acts chapter 9, where he's going to arrest and persecute Christians. And this same God of light that appears to people all over the globe today appears to him. And he says, who are you, Lord? And he says, I'm Jesus, who you're persecuting. And so I'm trying to show that this same God of light that appeared to Moses on Mount Sinai and said, I am who I am, right? But he appeared in this brilliant light that didn't burn the bush. And that same light appears to Israel. Well, interestingly, that same God appears to Bibi from Tehran, who I interviewed, who in Persian, Farsi, says when she has a heart attack and there's this God who looks like a man, but giant and light coming out of him. And he says to her, I am he who is, and boom, she's back in her body. And so you see the Santosh in Rwanda was a Muslim imam who dies of blood cancer. His mom, his dad was a Muslim sheikh. His mom was basically a witch doctor for the goddess Baco. Nothing would work to save her son. She goes to the Anglican Church and asks them to pray because she heard that some had been healed in Jesus' name. So the Anglican Church is praying, she's praying, and Swidik says he dies. And into this, again, it was a hellish experience, he described it first, but into this walks this man in a robe, a gold sash, and light coming out of him, just bursting into Swidik's eyes. And he holds out his hands, and Swidik sees holes in his hands. And he said, that's when I knew who this was, because I had seen the Passion of the Christ when it came to Rwanda. And Jesus says to him, he doesn't say, I'm Jesus. He said, I died for mankind. You're among those I died for. Never deny it and tell it to everyone. And I point out that these people have a lot to lose. Swidik has had 7 attempts on his life. Now he's an Anglican pastor, and he's had 7 attempts on his life because he won't shut up about Jesus. Now, on and on and on. Atheists, agnostics, people in Singapore, a professor in Australia. It doesn't matter their background, their religious background. They are experiencing the God of the Bible. And what I'm trying to show in Imagine the God of Heaven is that God actually put historical evidence into actual history that shows he is who he is. And near-death experiencers actually correlate with that. So it's not just near-death. I think if you just listen to people who have had near-death experiences, and each one is interpreting their experience, because as Eben said, it's truly of a dimension beyond ours. So how do you if we were living our 3-dimensional experience on a flat black and white painting, and then death is your soul leaves that world, you're peeled off into a 3-dimensional world of color and experience this, and then you're pressed back into that flat black and white painting. How do you describe 3 dimensions of color in flat black and white 2-dimensional terms? And every near-death experiencer I've interviewed has said, yet that's it. It's dimensions beyond ours. So all that to say, I think there's a whole other body of evidence that actually gives creed to the fact, I believe that's a fact, that God has not left us, without knowledge of who he is, what his will is, what his heart and character is. And I'm tracing how the commonalities of what near-death experiencers around the globe say, how that correlates with the heart and character of this amazingly personal God.
Well, we are going to pick back up on that on the other side of the break. Dr. Alexander, I'm going to get some of your reaction to that. But we've got to take a break now. You can get in touch with us over on social media, on X and on Instagram and Facebook. On X, it's at UnbelievableFE, and it's at Premier Unbelievable, both on Instagram and Facebook. And if you want to interact with us, you can do that over on those platforms. Hit that subscribe button or take a moment to follow or rate our podcast. We are here with John Burke and Dr. Alexander, and we'll be back in just a moment with more Premier Unbelievable.
I really don't think that AI as it is now is on a trajectory to becoming conscious, but it will certainly seem as though machines have conscious minds, and that's a danger.
If consciousness is a property of the brain, then it's subject to what we call causal determinism, physical determinism.
This idea of libertarian free will, I think, is entirely wrong, and I also think is unnecessary.
These systems will become more and more like us. People will treat them and want them to be treated as though they're human. The challenge now is it seems to be going faster and faster.
We are terrible at projecting out long-term consequences.
Robot rights, I can see it coming.
Welcome back. You're listening to Unbelievable with me, Billy Hallowell, and with me are two very, very excellent experts on this topic of NDEs, near-death experiences. We have authors John Burke. He's the author of many amazing books, and most recently, Imagine the God of Heaven. We also have Dr. Eben Alexander, a doctor whose NDEs caused him to write this quote, and he said this, but I want to repeat it because it's important. There is no scientific explanation for the fact that while my body lay in coma, my mind, my conscious inner self, was alive and well. So we've got a lot to cover here, but at the end of that last segment, Dr. Alexander, we heard from John on a variety of things. Now, I know in your experience, in your NDE, you did not encounter Jesus. What do you make of the commonalities that John just mentioned in people's stories who were not necessarily Christians by any stretch, but encountered Jesus in their NDE?
Well, I think, for one thing, Christ is an incredibly important prophet and figure of the spiritual realm. I mean, no question. When I look at some of the quotes from Christ, the kingdom of God lies within you, and these things and greater you shall do. I mean, to me, he was a very profound messenger of the reality of idealism or panentheism, which, as a scientist, here we are 2,000 years later, and I'm kind of coming to agreement with everything that he was pointing out so wisely so long ago, and all about the binding force of love. I mean, that's what near-death experiencers and the whole literature on near-death experiences is all about. A deeper understanding of that unconditional love and how kindness, compassion, mercy, acceptance, when necessary, forgiveness, that these are the deep lessons we are to learn from all this. And that's where I would also reflect a bit on what John was saying. I think it's beautiful that, our religious teachings can be in such beautiful alignment with near-death experiences. But if there's ever any kind of discordance there, my gut reaction is to side with the NDEs as being the leader. And the reason I bring that up is it's wonderful to look at kind of an idealized form of say, Christianity as one example. And yet I know of examples that I have seen in the modern Christian tradition where people would fall away from a universal, unconditional love for all fellow beings. And it would be somewhat conditional and somewhat, kind of exceptional and inclusive only to a certain group. And I would only caution that any religion that is going that way and it's using its ideologies to actually work against universal love, unconditional love for all fellow beings, is to be, watched out for that. I don't think that's as authentic. And to me, it's very powerful that we don't have to rely on 2,000-year-old scripture. We can rely on reports of human experiences in the modern era, combined with, the science of quantum physics, neuroscience of consciousness, philosophy of mind, parapsychological evidence of non-local consciousness, as we do in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, to make a very powerful case about the primacy of mind and this God force as being at the core of it all. So I think it's just important not to let the ideology start driving the bus, but to stay on board with the deepest and most profound principles. And those principles, as elucidated by the NDE community, are all about unconditional love, kindness, compassion, mercy, acceptance, really being here to take care of each other, take care of the least, the last, and the lost. And I know in today's kind of political polarization, it might be unpopular, but the reality is it's incumbent on us as human beings and as spiritual beings to take care of refugees that are being driven from war-torn countries and from political persecution across the world. We need to be soulful about taking care of our fellow soulmates. And also, at the end of the day, ultimately recognizing that these deep, profound truths about consciousness and the primordial nature of consciousness is also very important in our consideration of our animal friends. They are sharing this beautiful kind of God force of mind. In many ways, they have a kind of a pure spiritual essence than we do. We don't have a little, rational, logical center, linguistic center in our brain trying to talk us out of our spiritual experiences. The animals have a pretty free reign. And there's no question they're encountered very richly in these spiritual experiences. You find people encountering their pets, favored hunting dogs, horses, what have you. So this awakening in spirituality also will involve, some kind of rectification of how we interact with our animal friends, because they are part of this whole huge kind of package of the one mind and the spiritual awakening.
And it's interesting because, John, I want to throw to you. I gave Dr. Alexander that question, but obviously in his case, and I know others, Jesus does not appear, to people. So I'd love to get your response to maybe why you think that might be the case in some of these NDEs, and then any other response you might have to what Dr. Alexander just said.
There is a consistency, and I quote Eben in my first book, Imagine Heaven. Because a lot of the things that he said in that book are what people consistently say that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I recall that this God that was experienced was more personal than you would have ever associated qualities with God. Human-like qualities like empathy and compassion and even humor, love, beyond what we could imagine, and this is all very common. Now, where I think we would probably disagree is that love, yes, I agree with Eben when he's saying, the Christian scriptures can sometimes be used as a weapon to divide people, and I am promoting the opposite of that. I'm trying to show that what God actually revealed through the Christian scriptures is that he's always cared about all people of all nations. That's in the Bible, and it's what NDEs are consistently saying as well. But I think where we might diverge, Eben and I, is that that consistently this God that people experience is personal. In other words, this is not Atman is Brahman. It's in India, there is not the dissolution of the self into, the eternal consciousness, one consciousness, where we lose our sense of self. There is a oneness, like Jesus prayed for in John 17, when he said, Father, I pray that they may all be one, even as you are in me and I am in you, may they be in us, so that the world might believe you sent me. And so there is a consistent oneness that people experience on the other side, but also a separateness. And I quoted Eben in Imagine Heaven as saying the same thing, that even though there was this oneness and this closeness and connectedness to God, there was also a vastness to God that was way beyond, and we're still ourselves. That's another important thing. I mean, we recognize other selves. And if God is love, which, by the way, is what God told Moses, that love is what he cares about most. Jesus said that the first and greatest commandment is to love God. The second is to love your neighbor as yourself. That sums up the whole Bible. So that should be the lens through which we're looking at everything else. And by the way, that is exactly what near-death experiencers having a life review come back and say. God is love, that's for sure. And what he cares most about is how we treat one another, how we love one another. But there's one other thing that I think is really, really important that gets neglected, is that God did put evidence in history that he is real. And, I agree with what I've read Living in a Mindful Universe, and I agree with a lot of things that Eben writes there about how, we are all subjective in our experience. And so, who can know, who can stand up and say, I know the truth? And I don't know all the truth. I don't know it at all. And I think any Christian who thinks we know all the truth, I mean, I'm trying to show that we put God in a box and we need to expand that box. There's a lot of beauty and mystery to God that we don't understand. However, if there is a God, like all this evidence suggests, then we should look also at history to say, has this God claimed to reveal anything about himself in human history And is there a way to verify that? And it turns out there is. And in Imagine the God of Heaven, I go into quite a few instances of that. I'll give you just one. The book of Isaiah was written in about 780 BC, so about almost 800 years before Jesus. And in Isaiah chapter 9, and by the way, this whole thing of God is going to send a Messiah, a savior of the world. Okay, Messiah just means anointed one. That was foretold in about 60 different places over 1,500 years before Jesus was ever born. Isaiah, we happen in the Dead Sea Scrolls to find a complete copy predating, carbon dated to predate Jesus by 100 to 250 years. So proof positive. You can go out and read what I'm going to, tell you about here. That is predating Jesus, this translation. It's out on the internet. So Isaiah 9 says that to Galilee will come a great light. A child will be born, a son will be given, who will be called Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And the reign of his peace and government will never end. Okay, so this is a Judeo context where there is only one God. And so to say that a child and a son is going to be called God, who is this? And this was the formation of this idea of Messiah. Fast forward to Isaiah 53, and there it lays out everything this Messiah is going to do. Okay, he's going to be killed for our sins, pierced for our transgressions. He's going to be assigned a grave with the wicked and the rich in his death. Jesus was supposed to be thrown in a mass grave with the criminals he was crucified with. Joseph of Arimathea, who was a rich Pharisee, one of the ones of the Sanhedrin who had him crucified, became a believer and goes and places Jesus in his rich man's tomb. Yet this is written 780 years before. And then after, and we're talking about he was wounded for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that made us whole was on him. Why? Because all of us, like sheep, have wandered off from God. That's what it says in Isaiah 53. And then it says, after he has done all these things, he will prolong his days, okay? Although you make his soul an offering for sin, this is exact quoting Isaiah, Dead Sea Scroll version, he will prolong his days, resurrection, the will of the Lord will triumph in his hands, out of his suffering, his soul will see the light. But we're talking about crucifixion, resurrection, what Jesus would do. These are just 2 of 60 prophecies, and we have another one in Daniel chapter 9 that tells the exact timing of when this Messiah would come. It would have to be before the destruction of the temple. Well, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, has not been rebuilt since. So all these things, my point is, and I go into it in a lot more depth than Imagine the God of Heaven, the same God of light and love has been revealing himself all along. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. When he was transfigured before 3 of his disciples, they reported his face became brighter than the sun. And he was showing them his true nature, his glory. And I go into, I know, confusion about the Trinity. If Jesus was God, then who is ruling the universe? And I go into an analogy in the book that I think helps make a lot of sense of that. Jesus was not revealing all the mystery and all there was to God, who is infinite and eternal. God is infinite and eternal. And like Eben said, everywhere, always. Paul said he's in him we live and move and have our being. So he is the life force within us. He is with all of us all the time. Where I think Eben and I might disagree is he's also transcendent. He's beyond what he created. And people having a near-death experience get a sense that there is a distinction and an otherness, as well as a oneness and a unity. So anyway, all that to say, I think this is so important because love is relational. Love requires a subject and an object. And if God is the creator who is love and created us for his love, out of love, and to love one another, as the scripture says, to have this family of all nations, then the most important thing is not figuring, and I don't disagree that figuring out all the science and mechanics and questions of how quantum physics and consciousness relate, and I'm all for it. I love that stuff, and I'm very curious about it. But the primary question is, if there is a God of love who created me, and he wants me to love and follow him, then I need to find out who this God is and seek him with all my heart. That's the most important thing, because otherwise, what matters? What matters more than that? And that's really the mission I'm on, is to help people see how wonderful this God is, how he uniquely knows you. He's always been with you. He wants to help you through life. And he feels that way about everyone of all the nations. And what he did through Jesus, very importantly, was because he's also just and holy. I have a Hindu manufacturing engineer who sees the kingdom of heaven described in Revelation 21 and says God is holy, and he sees his sinfulness and he realizes the separation, yet he also experiences this compassion and forgiveness. And why? Well, because God did something about our rebellion against him. He paid for his own sense of justice. Why? So that every human heart that turns back to him and wants God's love has it. It's a free gift. There's no price to be paid. And I think that's what NDEs are also describing. In the presence of God, they see a life review. They say, I was my own judge. They say, I knew my wrongs. I knew my rights. I could see it clearly. There's no hiding from the truth. And yet God unconditionally loved me. Yeah, because he is unconditional love. He can't do otherwise.
Dr. Alexander, there's a lot to unpack there, that one area of potential disagreement. I'd love to give you a chance to respond to that.
Well, I don't think we disagree. I mean, dealing with an awareness and a knowing of the transcendental nature of that God force of pure love is something that was right at the heart of my NDE. So I would not be one disagreeing with you about that amazingly transcendent nature. And of course, it is deeply personal. That's the thing that to me was so absolutely surprising and affirming and validating and wonderful about the experience. It was like returning home to a spiritual home. And so many NDEers are in agreement about that. And I would simply close by reminding people of the research Bruce Grayson has done. He's a skeptical MD psychiatrist who's studied NDEs for more than 45 years now. And in an article he wrote in the Journal of Near-Death Studies in the fall of 2021, he broke down almost 700 life reviews that he had in his database of NDEers. And again, I've said this before, but I want to stress that something like 74% of the people who were going through that said it was an experience from all perspectives. So in other words, don't expect just your little perspective in your NDE. You get to see how your actions and even thoughts influence the people around you, because the NDE is so grand, this expansion of conscious awareness, that you get to become those other minds, to see what it was like to be dealing with you. And that's where NDEs are the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated, written into the fabric of the universe. Now, the science on this is actually quite clear. We are moving, and this includes quantum physics and the 4 decades of work that led to the Nobel Prize Committee giving out that award for entanglement. That's been a giant kind of slugfest between materialist scientists who were trying to explain it in any way that didn't involve consciousness. And now all the experiments finally are kind of pushing us into a corner where the only interpretation is this primordial mind, this God mind, that is influencing all of the underlying reality independently of our four-dimensional space-time. Now, the reason I mention it all here is that so many of the ills of our modern society, greed, corporate greed, for example, in the energy industry, those scientists in the energy industry knew in the early 20th century that burning carbon-based fuels would lead to a hot planet that ultimately would become unlivable. But they didn't care. The profit motive was too grand, and they saw themselves as separate beings in competition with other beings. That's where the deep truth of the worldview emerging from the scientific analysis of near-death experiences and related experiences is so important, because it is teaching us that we are all part of one mind. To hurt another is to hurt ourselves in a very literal sense. So we really live in a world bound together through these forces of love. We know that at the deepest level, there's not some battle between good and evil. At the deepest level, it's that pure God force of love. That's what NDEs talk about. Now, if we go to the 3 or 4% who have a hellish NDE, a very small percentage, but they exist, to me, the majority of those appear to be incomplete. They're a life review where maybe they didn't like the kind of evil and hardship they were handing out to other people when they were on the receiving end of it. And that was enough to be a hellish NDE. But they're, the overall message is really one of our sharing the one mind, and that the binding force is truly one of love. We're not in competition with each other. It's not a zero-sum game, but this is really about that God of abundance, that God of love. And as we come to acknowledge this, and as this kind of worldview, which is supported fully by the science, starts to expand, we can expect the world to become a far more peaceful, harmonious, and livable place.
John, we are rounding out to the end here. We've got about 2 minutes. If you could give us, just in light of what Dr. Alexander just said, that was a great sort of conclusion to his thoughts on this. What does all of this point us to when we look at the entirety of NDEs and what we should take away from them? We've talked a little bit about it, but I'd love for you to give us sort of the final word on the purpose and where you think it leads us.
Well, let me say, I agree with Dr. Alexander about the life review is such a powerful realization of what matters most, and that there is a connectedness, and we do get to see how our actions influence others, and it does align completely with what Jesus taught. I would say there is evil, though, and NDEers attest to that. And it's not, even in an IAN, reported in IANS, 23% of people in a study had hellish near-death experiences. In 2019, the European Academy of Neurology reported closer to 50% across 35 countries, reported more of a disturbing or hellish experience. Now, I don't think, and this is a very important thing, after studying these for 35 years, I don't think near-death experiences are either eternal life or eternal death. They are a peak. And this is really important. One of the commonalities that people have in near-death experiences, they come to a border or a boundary they knew they couldn't cross over and still come back to earth life. That's very important. Because, and in some cases, and imagine the God of heaven, Jesus is telling them, you must go back. You haven't died yet they had no brainwaves. And so, or he says, you can come on, but they know they have to cross over and then they can't come back. So what I mean by this is that near-death experiences can tell us about the reality of the life to come. And they tell us a lot. They color in, I think, a lot of what the scriptures have already told us, but they can't tell us what's beyond the border or boundary when there's a crossing over into eternal life, or I think there's also eternal death. And I've interviewed many people who have experienced that and would agree. But the hope of all that is that God has made it so easy for any person to be right with him and know that they are loved, know that they are his beloved child, unique, like no other. And that is why he did what he did through Jesus. And I think that is, again, for me, that's the most important truth. And I think near-death experiencers confirm it, that there is a God who cares infinitely about each and every one of us. And that's how great he is. It can always be with all of us. He can always hear every little concern and care. And not only that, he's such a mind that he has a will, but he can also work good through all the independent free will decisions of billions of people and work it for good for the most people. And so all that to say is love is the point. And that's exactly what Jesus taught. And I think that's what NDEs are confirming as well. And the first is to figure out who God is. Because if God is the source of all love, then to be disconnected from that source is a problem. But I would say, on the other hand, connect it. And I agree with Eben that a regular routine of mindful prayer, centering prayer, not just yelling at God, but listening, and I go into that as well, can help us align our will more and more with his will. And that does bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. That's what Jesus taught us to pray. Not my will be done, your will be done on earth like it is in heaven. And it's awesome in heaven.
Well, that is a very perfect place for us to close. We're going to have to leave it right there today. I want to thank my guests for joining me, and be sure to check out John Burke's book, Imagine the God of Heaven, and Dr. Alexander's 3-book collection set. It includes Proof of Heaven, Living in a Mindful Universe, and The Map of Heaven. Follow this podcast on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to rate and review the show. We'd really appreciate that. It has been so great to be with you, and we'll see you next time. Until then, from me, Billy Hallowell, and the team here, goodbye.